Well, hello everybody and welcome to another episode, and in this episode we're going to have a look at one of the smallest DSLR style cameras I've ever seen. I'm talking about this one, the Olympus OMD E-M10, and if you're looking for a budget mirrorless camera, there are few nicer than this one. This one is about as good as it gets. This camera has a 16 megapixel micro four thirds sensor with no AA filter for increased sharpness. It's got 3-axis image stabilization, 2 control dials and a magnesium alloy body. It's got a top shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second, and the ISO range is between 200 and 6400. It shoots all the micro four third lenses, and it shoots almost all vintage lenses too. This is a very powerful little machine. Now, there is an inevitable comparison to be drawn here between this camera and another. In fact, the name of the camera invites us to draw that comparison, and it harks back to the old OM Zuiko film SLRs that I like so much, and I've got one of those here. This is an OM2. The film OMs were very small cameras, and that's why I like them so much, but compared to this one, the film OMs are monsters. This E-M10 is in a league of its own when it comes to size. Let's have a look at them side by side for comparison. So here are our two Olympuses, or Olympi, or Olympians, and if we put them together, you will be able to see that the one is much smaller than the other. The E-M10 is at the bottom, the OM2 is at the top, and that's a significant difference in size widthways. And the OM2 is a little bit taller than the E-M10, although not by too much. You can really see very clearly the design cues in both cameras, and there's a clear house style going on here and a clear desire on the minds of the manufacturers to recreate something of the feel with the feel of the older camera here, and I think they've succeeded really well in that. Even the top decks are clearly not the same, but vaguely similar, and the whole thing has a similar sort of feel between the two cameras, and that is nice to see. So looking a bit more closely at the E-M10 now, we'll have a look at its top plate, and we can see there that the two control wheels are there. This one is around the shutter button. The shutter button's in the centre of it, and then there's one on the back that turns very easily with the thumb. We've got a PASM dial on here, so there shouldn't be any surprises if you're coming to this camera from another digital model. So we've got the usual settings: manual, shutter priority, aperture and program, and then we've got fully auto, intelligent auto, and we've got art filters plus various other settings on there. Turning the camera round, we've got on the back a very nice big screen, which unfortunately does not flip out sideways. I know that's not everybody's cup of tea, but for me that's a very useful function. So it will flip that way, and it will also flip that way, but it won't flip out to the side. The screen itself is nice and big, nice high-res screen, lots of information on there. We've also got menu and info buttons, the 4-way pad here with an OK in the centre, and then the power switch in an unusual place down the bottom here. Very, very lovely little camera, and I've got the SLR Magic 35mm f1.7 lens on here at the moment, and I've been shooting with that, and this is a really nice little lens, so I think I'm going to use this quite a bit more than I have done. I bought this quite a while back, but never really used it too much. It seems on this camera, to me anyway, to have perfect proportions, and so that's another reason to mount it on these little Olympus cameras. But a very beautiful little piece of kit. No space wasted, all the space used efficiently, powerful and capable as any other camera you might care to name, but much, much smaller. This is a really nice camera to use, and it's a really easy camera to like as well. There's just something about it that is delightful. That's the only word I can think of for it. I do like small cameras, and this, I think this must be the smallest I've seen in a DSLR style. I know the Pentax Q is smaller, but that has a very much smaller chip. For a micro four thirds sensor body, this really is a very tiny camera indeed. Even though it's small though, it still has a fair bit of weight, and you can tell there's a real quality of construction here. This is not a plastic fantastic by any means. I've been out shooting this camera over the past couple of weeks or so, and I've really got on with it and really enjoyed it. So why don't we go and have a look and see how I got on. So we're out shooting with this E-M10, and it's just such a lovely little thing. It fits into the hands perfectly. I have fairly small hands, but it's just right to hold. It just feels nice. There's something about this camera that is just right. Everything falls very easily to hand. All the controls are within easy reach. You can operate them almost one-handed, actually, perhaps not quite, but it's a very, very easy camera to hold, to operate, to use. This is a camera that really knows how to get out of its own way. It's not obtrusive, it's not an enormous millstone round your neck as some cameras are. It's fairly heavy if you mount a vintage lens on it. I've got the Olympus 55mm f1.2 on here at the moment. That's quite a large lens. I think it suits the camera quite nicely, actually. It does look a little large, but I think we can get away with that. I think that looks fine. So it is a bit heavy with vintage lenses, but then all mirrorless cameras are. There's no real way around that. If you use it with a micro four thirds lens, of course, then it becomes much lighter, much smaller, but I don't think this is any handicap at all. The body of this camera, as I understand it, is all metal, and it's likely to be some sort of magnesium alloy. One thing's for sure though, it's very, very well made. It feels really tight and together. It feels like the precision instrument that it is. Image quality from this camera is truly outstanding, and for a small camera, for a crop sensor camera, a micro four thirds body, it packs a very, very powerful punch. It easily makes images that compare very well and stand alongside images from cameras with larger sensors, APS-C cameras, and even full frame cameras, although of course the character of the image is not the same. But in terms of quality, I don't think there's anything lacking at all on here. These are some of the nicest images that I've seen from a camera, and I think it's really, really successful in terms of image quality. It's got really, really nice colours as well. Olympus have long been known for the excellence of their colour science, and this camera maintains that tradition. Colours are stunning, some of the nicest I've seen from any camera. The colours are rich and strong and very, very nicely balanced. There's no overall sort of favouring of one colour. There's no cast on any of the shots. It shoots reds nicely, which digital cameras still to this day can have problems with. And if I compare it again to my other micro four thirds camera, my Panasonic GH2, colours are infinitely superior. I just never could, despite how much I tried and how much I played around with white balance and various other settings. I just couldn't get the colours quite right, for stills anyway, on the GH2, and they always ended up with a slight sort of greenish cast or a tendency to go towards that. There's nothing like that happening on this camera. Of course, if you're shooting a digital camera, the screen and the viewfinder quality are important. And I'm glad to say they're both of good quality on this camera. They're fairly high resolution. I don't know the exact resolution, but it's high enough to give very clear, very smooth images through both the viewfinder and the screen on the back. The screen is a nice large one. Let me show you. So I don't know if that's how clear that is, but that is a nice big screen, lots of resolution, lots of detail, no problem there. It's got an automatic sensor, so that as you move your eye nearer to the camera, then the viewfinder comes up. You probably can't see it there. That's a bit of an ambitious shot, I think, on my part. But the viewfinder too is very high resolution. Now I do have one gripe with this viewfinder, which is that if you're looking at the menu and you put your eye to the viewfinder, then you can't see the menu through the viewfinder. The camera will automatically switch back to shooting mode. I found that a little bit annoying, actually. I'm sure there's probably a setting to change it somewhere, but I couldn't find it in the menu. So just a minor gripe there. I would like to be able to see that menu through the viewfinder in case the light is too strong and I can't see it on the screen. Now I must admit I didn't immediately take to the menus on this camera. It's a nice looking menu interface. In fact, it's the nicest looking menu interface I've seen yet. But I didn't find it a terribly effective interface, and there were occasions where I had to hunt around for fairly simple things, actually, like picture style. Very simple things like that. I found that they weren't too easy to get to in the menu. Some of that is my own familiarity, of course, with this camera, but if I'm using an unfamiliar camera, then it's a good gauge of how good that menu is, as to how quickly I can use it and get into it without having to look through instruction manuals and so on. The easier it is to use, the more intuitive it is to use. I didn't find this menu particularly intuitive to use. It is fine, there's no problem with it, and a lot of it is familiarity, but I'm not sure it's quite as good as other menu systems I've looked at. Now this camera uses focus peaking. It does have a peaking system, however I didn't find it the easiest one to use. It has to be activated by pushing the function 2 button on the top of the camera there. So it's not activated, even when you're in manual focus, it's not activated automatically, and you have to push this switch every time you want the peaking to appear. It's not as though you can push the switch and it stays there. So I must admit, I found that not a terribly easy way to use peaking. I'm not sure it's the ideal way. I found it very fiddly having to push the button every time. Also, the record button for video is right next to the function 2 button, so it's very easy to push that when you're trying to bring the peaking up. The peaking itself is effective. It's single color white. It is effective, but not terribly easy to, or at least not the easiest system of focus peaking that I've yet tried. In addition to that, as soon as you press or half press the shutter button to prepare to take your shot, then the peaking is lost. So we can't see the shot that we will finally end up with and have peaking at the same time. Other cameras do that, the Fuji cameras do that. I'm not a fan of it. The Sony cameras don't do it, and that's a good point in their favour. So generally speaking, the peaking system is effective, it's there and it works nicely, and you will find focus using it. But it's not as easy as the peaking systems in other cameras to use, or at least I didn't find it so. Now, this being a mirrorless camera, there is a massive choice of lenses to choose from. There's a whole massive range of micro four thirds lenses. Some of them are really nice, and in fact even the simple kit ones like the one I've got, the Panasonic 14 to 42 that I've been shooting on here, even those lenses are actually really nice. Micro four thirds lenses tend to have inherent sharpness, and they're created in order to angle the rays of light that come from the back of the lens as perpendicularly onto the sensor as possible. And there are some really nice ones. Some of them are quite cheap as well, so you've got all that range to choose from. Also, as it's a mirrorless camera, its party trick, as with all other mirrorless cameras, is that it can shoot any vintage lens, or well, pretty much any vintage lens anyway. There are one or two exceptions. Some lenses, vintage lenses, have a big rounded rear element, like the Jupiter 12 I think is one such. That won't fit on mirrorless cameras, but pretty much any lens that's ever been made you can adapt to one of these cameras somehow. So that gives you a massive range to choose from. Now, I've found this works really nicely with micro four thirds lenses. It makes fantastic images with those, and it also works really nicely with vintage lenses too. I've been using this Olympus f1.2 on it, as I say, stopped down to f2 to get it a bit sharper. It's very nice if you do that. Also, I've been using the DSLR Magic 35mm f1.7, which I think is possibly a CCTV lens repurposed, or maybe some sort of C-mount lens repurposed, I'm not sure. But it's a very nice little optic. It's specially made for micro four thirds cameras. It's manual focus with a nice wide aperture of f1.7, and it will give you some nice blurry background. In fact, it's tuned to give particularly nice blurry background, and I think it succeeds in that. It's a very nice little lens, and they're really cheap as well. Great little lens if you want to just test out manual photography. So a massive range of lenses can be used on this camera, and in my experience at least, they all work nicely, whether they're modern micro four thirds lenses or lenses of the vintage variety. Now, this camera has a feature that I've not used on a camera before. I seem to be a little bit behind the times when it comes to some of the more modern cameras, and it works really nicely. It's 3-axis stabilization, so it's not quite as fancy as the 5-axis stabilization that the EM1 and EM5 both have, but this seems to work pretty nicely. It'll give you an extra stop or two of exposure if you're in poor light shooting stills, and it's good for video too. I shot this footage on the Olympus 55mm f1.2, which is a very long lens on this camera. In fact, effectively that has a focal length of 110mm on micro four thirds, because you're looking through the more central portion of the lens. So on this camera it's a very long lens indeed, and this handheld video, it does have one or two shakes and stutters on it, but it's pretty good for handheld on a very long manual lens. So I think the stabilization system really confers some advantage on this camera. As I say, it gives you a stop or two extra in low light, and it means that any video that you grab is likely to be nice and steady and not to have too many jitters and things of that nature about it. As regards the quality of video, well, it's not bad. It's suitable and usable for everyday video clips. It's got very nice colour, it's got that stabilization to give you a steady shot, but it's only 30 frames per second. There's no other frame rate, there's no microphone input, and generally it's not pro level video. I wouldn't have thought. It's perfectly fine for day-to-day shooting, but I certainly wouldn't advise making any sort of documentary or short or any pro production on it, because I don't think it's quite up to it. This camera does seem to overexpose quite a lot, often by a stop or more, which I was quite surprised by. I've seen other mirrorless cameras overexpose, mainly using vintage lenses, but not by the amount that this one has overexposed. I don't know if it's this particular camera or whether it's a common feature of the E-M10. I really don't know. Originally I thought it was because I was using vintage lenses, but when I put my micro four thirds lens on it, the story was the same. Overexposure by about one stop. Now it's not difficult to correct that. There's an exposure compensation dial, or at least this front dial on my camera is mapped to operate the exposure compensation, so it's very simple to adjust, but I was quite surprised by the amount it overexposes. Really unexpected. Although I will say, in its defense, it never overexposed to the point where things were blown out, just that the images looked rather too bright. I've really had a great time with this little camera. It's a very attractive and likeable little machine, and I pretty much fell in love with it as soon as I first put my hands on it. It does have some foibles and quirks. It does have one or two points that I don't personally find ideal, but overall it's so nice that I'm just going to give it a pass on everything, because it's just such a lovely little camera. I've really bonded with it, I've really enjoyed using it, and I think if you're looking for a mirrorless camera in that doesn't cost too much money, this is absolutely ideal. If you haven't particularly got your heart set on full frame or any particular type of sensor, again, this camera's ideal. It's great for learning. It will teach you all the basics of photography. It's great for more advanced users. It's got all the features, all the powerful features that you need in a camera of this kind. And my goodness, these are cheap at the moment. You can buy one of these cameras for between £100 and £150, and as far as I'm concerned, that's got to be one of the biggest bargains out there in the world of photography just at the moment. So there we are. There's the lovely little Olympus E-M10, a very, very nice little camera, and a really capable one too. It's got its quirks and foibles, but generally it's such a nice camera that I'm really not going to worry too much about any of those. It's entirely usable and it makes great images. It's a very, very powerful little machine. Perhaps best of all is the price. I bought this camera for £130, and I have seen them go for as low as £100. This is a fully capable camera. You can learn photography on it. You can use it for any kind of photography you like. You can fit pretty much any lens ever made of the vintage variety onto it, plus loads and loads of really fantastic modern micro four thirds glass. If there is such a thing as the best bargain in mirrorless cameras at the moment, this has got to be a contender. So that's it from me for now. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring that bell before you go. And if you like the content on this channel and you'd like to support it to help it grow and to develop, you can do that at patreon.com/Zenography. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time for some more Zenography.